Please, you have to help me. I can't find my mother. They are coming for me.
I won't let anyone hurt you.
Please, just pretend you're hugging me so I can get away. A desperate child whispered this to a stranger who was, without the boy knowing it, a billionaire about to have his entire life rewritten. A man who had spent 15 months moving through the world like a ghost in an expensive coat and who had no idea. In that first startled second before his arms closed protectively around a trembling stranger's child, that he was about to remember, all at once and without warning, exactly what it felt like to be needed by someone again. Before we dive into this incredible journey, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether a stranger has ever made a difference in your life. Let's begin our story. A cold December rain fell heavily on the sidewalks of Lower Manhattan, turning the financial district into a wet concrete maze beneath a gray sky strung with holiday lights, blinking sadly against the storm. Daniel Cross pulled his Italian wool coat tighter as he walked aimlessly through the heart of the district, his therapist's words still echoing in his mind. Daniel, you cannot simply exist. Living and existing are two entirely different things. 15 months. 15 months since the car accident that took Alice and the baby they were expecting. 15 months since his life had turned from a corporate fairy tale into a hollow existence fed by autopilot meetings and boardroom decisions that no longer meant anything. At 32, Daniel had built North Point Technologies into a company worth billions. But now, walking the icy streets of Manhattan, he felt like a ghost in his own life. He stepped carefully around puddles his expensive leather shoes would once have splashed through without a thought. The sound of small, hurried, desperate footsteps cut through the fog of self-pity surrounding him. A small figure collided with his legs so hard it nearly knocked him over. "Please," whispered an urgent, breathless voice. "Please, sir, just pretend you're hugging me." Daniel looked down in astonishment. Clinging to him was a small child, maybe 8 years old, with messy brown hair and clothes that had clearly seen better days. His green eyes were wide with terror, glancing frantically over Daniel's shoulder. "Ethan! Ethan, get back here right now!" a harsh voice shouted from behind them. The boy, Ethan, looked up at Daniel with eyes carrying a fear no child should ever know. "Please," he whispered again, "just for a minute. Pretend I'm your son." Something in the boy's desperate voice, something in those eyes reflecting a terror no child should understand, made the decision for Daniel. Without conscious thought, he wrapped the trembling child in his arms, pulling him close protectively. "Ethan, son," he said loudly, his voice carrying the natural authority he'd learned through years of high-stakes negotiations. "There you are. Dad's been looking everywhere for you." Two men in dark uniforms approached, their faces red from cold and discomfort. Daniel recognized the logo on their uniforms instantly. Security staff from one of the overcrowded state group homes in the outer boroughs. "Sir," the taller guard said, breath steaming into the cold air, "this is one of our children. He ran off during a supervised outing." Daniel felt Ethan's small hands gripping his coat with desperate strength. "I'm sorry," he said calmly, "but I think you're mistaken. This is my son, Ethan Cross." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel's expensive suit, his naturally commanding posture, his tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Everything about him suggested wealth and power. "Sir, we have records," the shorter guard began hesitantly. "Are you questioning my own son's identity?" Daniel's voice carried enough steel to make both men instinctively step back. "Because if you are, I'm sure my attorneys at Wilson and Hale would be very interested in discussing it." The name of the city's most prestigious law firm made them hesitate. "Of course not, sir. There must be some mistake. The boy we're looking for has darker hair." As the guards mumbled apologies and confused explanations before retreating, Daniel felt Ethan's desperate grip loosen slightly. But the boy didn't let go, And somewhere deep in Daniel's chest, something that had been frozen for 15 months began to crack like ice under a spring sun. "Thank you," Ethan whispered into his coat, his voice hoarse but full of pure gratitude. Daniel looked at this brave child, somehow stumbling into his life at the exact moment he'd been wondering whether he still had any reason to keep living. "You're welcome, Ethan, but I think we need to talk." And as the rain kept falling around them, forming a gray cocoon separating them from the rest of the world, neither of them yet knew that this desperate embrace was about to be the beginning of something that would save them both. But first, they had to survive what was coming, because Daniel Cross was about to discover that some rescue missions change the rescuer just as much as the rescued. Daniel walked Ethan through the elegant lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, New York, aware of the curious glances from other guests. The boy's worn sneakers made small sounds against the polished marble floor, and he walked with his head down, shoulders curled defensively, as if expecting someone to grab him at any moment. The contrast between Ethan's threadbare clothes and the hotel's luxury was almost painful to witness. Mr. Cross, the concierge, greeted respectfully, his professionally trained eyes barely registering Ethan's appearance. "Your suite is ready." "Thank you, David," Daniel said, his voice controlled, though his mind was racing with questions he couldn't answer. What was he doing? He had essentially interfered with legal custody, helped a child evade the authorities, but the pure terror in Ethan's eyes had awakened protective instincts Daniel didn't know he still had after months of emotional numbness. In the elevator, Ethan finally broke the stretching silence between them. "Why did you help me?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter this unexpected shelter. Daniel studied the boy's reflection in the elevator's polished metal doors. Despite everything, despite the fear, the exhaustion, the obvious neglect in his clothing and general appearance, Ethan's jaw carried a stubborn tilt that reminded Daniel painfully of his late wife, that same fierce determination, the absolute refusal to give up even when it seemed impossible. "Why did you run?" Daniel asked in return. "Because they were going to take my little brother away from me," Ethan whispered, his small hands curling into fists. "He's only 6. He can't survive there without me." The elevator opened with a soft chime on the top floor. Daniel's suite was proof of his extraordinary success, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, wrapped in gray rain, designer furniture worth more than most people's cars, a gourmet kitchen he rarely used, and artwork worth a fortune on the walls. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, completely overwhelmed by a wealth he'd never imagined existed. "Who's Charlie?" Daniel asked gently, guiding Ethan to the luxurious couch that could easily seat 10 people. "My little brother," Ethan said. "We've been together at the group home for a year and a half." Until Ethan stopped abruptly, his small hands twisting anxiously in his lap. "They said a family wants to adopt Charlie, but not me. They said I'm too old. 8 is too old, that nobody wants big kids who ask too many questions." Daniel's chest tightened with an emotion he thought had died along with Alice, righteous anger on behalf of someone else's pain. "And you've been protecting him this whole time." "Someone has to protect him," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly, revealing the enormous weight resting on this 8-year-old's shoulders. "He has nightmares about the fire, about our mom and dad not being there anymore. He won't eat if I don't remind him to." Tears began sliding down Ethan's cheeks. "I can't let them take him away from me. He's the only thing I have left in this entire world." For the first time in 15 months, Daniel felt a real sense of purpose sprouting in his chest, cutting through the thick fog of grief that had consumed him. "Ethan," he said carefully, "what if I told you there might be a different way? What if we could find a solution that lets you and Charlie stay together?" Ethan's eyes opened with hope so pure and so desperate it nearly broke Daniel's heart. Would you really do that for us? But you don't even know us. I'll try everything I possibly can, Daniel said, meaning it with every fiber of his being for the first time since Alice's funeral. But first you need warm food and a safe place to rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out exactly how to save your brother and how to make sure you two are never separated again. As Ethan finally settled into the plush guest room cushions, Daniel realized he had found something worth truly fighting for since Alice's death. Actually, two things, Ethan and Charlie, and he would turn the world upside down to protect these two children. But he had no idea yet how dark the forces working against them truly were, or that rescuing these children would require far more than money and influence. The next morning, Daniel sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Carter Wilson, his attorney of 20 years, overlooking the financial district. Carter's expression grew increasingly worried as Daniel explained the previous day's events, his manicured fingers tapping nervously against the leather desk, a nervous habit Daniel recognized from 2 decades of legal battles together. "If I understand correctly," Carter said slowly, removing his gold-rimmed glasses to clean them meticulously, "you want to adopt 2 children you met yesterday. One is technically a runaway from state custody, and you're asking me to make this happen immediately." "Ethan isn't a runaway, Carter. He's a terrified child trying to protect his little brother from a system that has completely failed him." Carter leaned back in his leather chair, studying his most successful client with genuinely concerned eyes. "Daniel, I understand you're still grieving Alice and the baby, but this isn't the way to fill that emotional void. Taking on severely traumatized children isn't summer therapy, and it's certainly not what Alice would have wanted for you. This isn't about filling a void," Daniel cut in sharply, though both of them knew that wasn't entirely true. "These children desperately need help, and I'm in a position to provide it. Unlimited financial resources, a stable home, and all the time in the world to dedicate myself completely to their healing." "The state won't see it that way," Carter countered with the brutal honesty of a 20-year friendship. "You're single, you have no parenting experience, and frankly, your mental state since the accident," his voice softened with real concern. "You've barely left your penthouse in 6 months. You've missed critical board meetings. Your assistant gets weekly calls from worried investors. The press is starting to ask questions about North Point's leadership stability." Daniel stood abruptly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "My mental state is perfectly stable. I function normally. I make business decisions. I manage all my responsibilities. You're surviving. You're not living," Carter said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine decades-old friendship. "There's a fundamental difference. I'm genuinely worried about you, but taking on severely traumatized children isn't a solution for your own pain." Daniel turned back to face his friend and legal counsel. "They're not broken projects to be fixed, Carter. They're brave survivors who've been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect them. If I don't fight for them, who will?" Back at the hotel suite, Daniel found Ethan curled up by the massive panoramic windows, still wearing yesterday's clothes despite several bags of new outfits delivered that morning. Against the impressive backdrop of Manhattan's skyscrapers, the boy looked impossibly small. A vulnerable figure, shrunken in a world far too large and merciless for his age. "How did it go with your lawyer?" Ethan asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the falling rain. Daniel sat carefully beside him on the window seat. He noticed Ethan instinctively tense up, then force himself to relax. "It's going to be complicated. The legal system isn't designed for situations like this. There are bureaucratic procedures, mandatory waiting periods, extensive psychological evaluations." Ethan nodded with the resigned wisdom of someone who had learned far too young that adults make promises they can't keep. "Okay, I understand. You tried to help, and that's already more than anyone has ever done for me and Charlie." "Ethan, look at me," Daniel said firmly, waiting until the boy's green eyes met his own. "I said complicated. I didn't say impossible. I don't give up easily on things that matter. Ask anyone who's ever tried competing with North Point. I fight until I win, especially when it comes to protecting people I care about. For the first time since they'd met, Ethan smiled. A real smile that completely lit up his young face. So what do we do now? Now we go visit Charlie officially, as your potential new family, Daniel said, picking up his phone and scrolling through a contact list representing decades of accumulated favors and carefully cultivated political influence. I'm going to call in every political and financial favor I have before the day is over. I want to understand exactly what we're fighting against and how we're going to win this fight. Ethan wrapped his thin arms around Daniel fiercely, and Daniel felt something he'd forgotten existed. Pure hope mixed with fierce determination, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. He finally had something worth truly fighting for again. The State Group home rose like a gray concrete fortress in a forgotten corner of the outer boroughs. Its narrow windows, metal bars, and tall fence topped with barbed wire made the building resemble a maximum security facility more than a place designed to nurture and protect vulnerable children. Daniel's sleek black Mercedes looked absurdly out of place in the rutted parking lot, drawing suspicious stares from several staff members visible through the building's grimy, stained windows. "I don't want to go back in there," Ethan whispered, his hand gripping Daniel's tightly enough to leave marks. His entire small body trembled violently as they approached an entrance that resembled a hungry mouth more than a doorway. "It smells like cheap disinfectant and sadness in there, and the walls are always cold no matter what season it is." "You won't have to stay here," Daniel promised with absolute conviction, squeezing the boy's hand reassuringly. "We're only visiting Charlie today, remember? Just long enough for both of you to know that someone is finally fighting seriously for you." Director Diane Reeves was a hard woman in her 50s, and her deep suspicion of Daniel was immediately obvious. Despite his expensive suit and obvious wealth, her office was plain and functional, decorated only with faded motivational posters about discipline-building character, and a single wilting plant that seemed to reflect the fading hope of the children in her questionable care. "Mr. Cross," Reeves said, her tone conveying something far from genuine appreciation, "thank you for your sudden interest in adoption. However, I must inform you that Ethan's son is not suitable for family placement. He has exhibited serious behavioral problems that would prevent proper adjustment to a family environment." "What specific behavioral problems exactly?" Daniel asked, his sharp business instincts immediately suspicious of such deliberately vague accusations. "Repeated escape attempts, constant defiance toward authority figures, complete inability to conform to our established disciplinary structure and basic communal living rules, has consistently proven detrimental to other more compliant children's placement opportunities." Reeves's tone was sharp and professional, but Daniel caught something more sinister beneath the surface. Genuine animosity directed at an 8-year-old child. "He constantly questions our administrative decisions, deliberately undermines our qualified staff, and has proven completely incapable of accepting age-appropriate discipline." Daniel felt Ethan shrinking beside him, trying to become invisible under the weight of these accusations. "He's 8 years old," Daniel said, his voice controlled but dangerous. "Age doesn't excuse consistently destructive and disrespectful behavior, Mr. Cross," Reeves replied coldly. "However, his brother Charlie is absolutely an excellent candidate for adoption. Well-behaved, compliant, obedient, no significant problems or challenges in his history. Several respectable families have already shown genuine interest in him. They walked through sterile corridors lined with motivational posters that seemed cruelly ironic, given the obvious despair permeating the place. Every day a new beginning hung directly above a damp stain on the cracked ceiling tiles. "Adversity builds character" was posted beside a door that had clearly not been opened in months. Children of various ages sat in a gloomy, dimly lit common room, their faces carrying that particular emptiness Daniel recognized from his own recent months, the look of people merely existing rather than truly living. Then Ethan released Daniel's hand and ran desperately toward a small boy with light brown hair and Ethan's same striking green eyes. The reunion was heartbreaking in its absolute desperate intensity. Charlie, who couldn't have been older than 6, threw himself into Ethan's arms and clung to him like a life raft in the middle of a raging ocean. Daniel realized with growing fury that this was probably exactly the situation. Charlie sobbed uncontrollably into Ethan's shoulder, his thin, small body shaking with terror mixed with overwhelming relief. "Ethan, they told me you were gone forever, that you'd never come back for me." Charlie's voice sharpened with absolute panic, words tumbling desperately over each other. "I couldn't eat yesterday or the day before. I couldn't find you anywhere at mealtimes. Aunt Elaine said a car probably hit you because disobedient children always have bad things happen to them. I'm here now, little one." Ethan soothed him with the practiced compassion of someone who had long since taken on a parental role. "I'm here, and I brought someone very special for you to meet. Someone who's going to help us stay together forever." Director Reeves watched this emotional reunion with obvious professional disapproval. You can clearly see how extremely problematic and psychologically damaging their mutual dependency has become. Charlie urgently needs to learn emotional independence and establish age-appropriate attachment boundaries. "He needs his brother's protection," Daniel said, watching with growing determination as Charlie clung to Ethan like the only solid, trustworthy thing in his unstable world. "And I want to adopt both of them together as an inseparable family unit." "That's absolutely out of the question," Reeves stated flatly. "Ethan is completely unsuitable for family placement due to his serious behavioral problems and proven inability to integrate into structured environments." That night, back at the hotel, Daniel had no idea that Director Reeves was already planning a vicious counterattack of her own, one designed to use the full weight of the law against him before he could use his resources against her. A phone call would come before dawn that threatened to unravel everything. It came at 6 in the morning, waking Daniel from the first genuinely peaceful sleep he'd had in 15 months. "Mr. Cross?" The voice was officially cold, carrying all the intimidating authority of law enforcement. "This is Detective Rachel Moore with the New York Police Department. We need to speak with you urgently regarding Ethan's son." Daniel's blood ran instantly cold. "You and the child need to come to police headquarters immediately for questioning on charges, including obstruction of legal custody and knowingly endangering a minor." 3 hours later, Daniel sat in a sterile interrogation room that reeked of industrial cleaning products, Ethan nervously beside him. Across from them sat Detective Moore, a woman in her 40s whose face was genuinely conflicted, and a sharp-faced woman from the Department of Child and Family Services named Elaine Ross. "Mr. Cross," Detective Moore began formally, opening a thick document folder, "you're facing extremely serious criminal charges: deliberately obstructing legal custody, knowingly harboring a runaway minor, and potential kidnapping charges that could result in years of imprisonment." "I helped a terrified child who was desperately seeking protection," Daniel said firmly. "You knowingly and deliberately assisted a minor in evading legal authorities," Ross interjected with an oily, artificially gentle tone. "Ethan was officially reported missing from state custody for 5 consecutive days. During that time, his brother Charlie was immediately placed with a pre-approved adoptive family." Ethan gasped audibly, his small body going completely rigid with absolute horror. "No, they couldn't have taken Charlie. I promised him I'd come back. He can't survive without me." Ross's voice took on a condescending tone. "Sometimes children make promises they simply cannot understand the full weight of, Ethan." "Exactly where is Charlie right now, and how long ago exactly was this placement approved?" Daniel demanded. Detective Moore and Ross exchanged a meaningful, conspiratorial glance that confirmed Daniel's growing suspicions. "This information is strictly confidential," Ross said. Mr. Cross, Detective Moore leaned forward threateningly. Your primary concern right now should be avoiding serious criminal charges. If you cooperate fully and immediately return Ethan to state custody, we're prepared to show considerable leniency. Daniel looked at Ethan, his small fists white-knuckled in his lap, tears silently streaming down his face. Everything within Daniel violently rebelled against the idea of returning this child to people who viewed him as a problem to be eliminated. I want to speak with my attorney immediately, and I won't say another word until legal representation is present. Detective Moore, Daniel said with deadly calm certainty. Before we proceed any further, I want to formally report several ongoing serious crimes: systematic institutional child abuse, conspiracy to separate siblings for direct financial gain, and extensive fraud in state adoption procedures. And I possess complete, irrefutable evidence for every single one of these accusations. Ross visibly paled, her professional composure finally cracking. Mr. Cross, you're making entirely baseless accusations. I am, Daniel said, picking up his phone, because I'm absolutely certain the department's financial crimes unit will be extremely fascinated by Layla Stone's meticulously documented research into Acacia House's systematic financial irregularities and the systematic abuse of extremely vulnerable children. As the adults stared at each other across the table in electric, tension-filled silence, Ethan whispered something that instantly stopped everyone cold. Charlie isn't really with a legally approved family, is he? He's still at the group home, probably in the punishment room they put children in who cry too much or ask too many uncomfortable questions. The lethal silence that followed told Daniel absolutely everything he needed to know. The real battle was just beginning, and now he finally understood exactly what kind of monsters they were truly fighting against. Within the hour, Daniel's legal team had secured an emergency welfare check order from a sympathetic night court judge, and Detective Moore, whose conscience had clearly been fighting her orders from the very start of the interrogation, quietly agreed to personally accompany them back to Acacia House, her patrol car leading Daniel's black Mercedes through empty pre-dawn streets with lights flashing but no siren, a small mercy that let them arrive before anyone inside had time to prepare. Director Reeves met them at the front entrance in a bathrobe, her carefully constructed authority stripped away by the early hour and the sudden appearance of a police detective at her door. "This is completely unnecessary and highly irregular," Reeves protested, but Detective Moore's badge and the signed court order left no room for argument. "Take us to Charlie's son immediately," Moore said, her voice now carrying none of the reluctant coldness from the interrogation room. Reeves led them, stalling with every step, down a back stairwell that smelled of mildew and old paint, past the sterile common rooms Daniel had seen before, to a heavy metal door at the end of a narrow basement corridor. A door with no window, no nameplate, nothing to indicate what lay behind it except a small sliding bolt lock on the outside, the kind of lock meant for a closet, not a room meant to hold a child. "This is simply our reflection room," Reeves said quickly, "for children who need quiet time to process difficult emotions." "Open it," Detective Moore said flatly. Inside, in a space barely 6 feet square with no window and a single bare bulb overhead, Charlie sat curled against the wall on a thin blanket, his knees pulled to his chest, his small body shaking. He had been crying so long his voice had gone hoarse, and when the door opened he flinched violently, throwing his arms over his head as though expecting to be struck. Ethan pushed past everyone and dropped to his knees in front of his brother, gathering him up instantly. "Charlie, it's me, I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Charlie's eyes opened slowly, disbelieving, and then he was sobbing into Ethan's shoulder with a force that shook them both. "They said you weren't coming back. They said I had to learn to be quiet or I'd stay in here forever." Detective Moore's face had gone white with fury as she surveyed the room. No toilet, no water, a single thin blanket, the temperature noticeably colder than the rest of the building. She turned to Reeves with an expression that finally, completely abandoned any pretense of professional restraint. "How long has this child been in this room?" Reeves's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed a response. "Since yesterday afternoon." He wouldn't stop crying about his brother, and it was disrupting the other children. 22 hours, Moore said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You locked a 6-year-old child in an unheated closet for 22 hours because he was grieving the disappearance of the one person who has protected him his entire life. Diane Reeves, you are under arrest for child endangerment and unlawful confinement of a minor. And I promise you this is only the beginning of the charges you're about to face." As officers began securing the building and evacuating children to emergency housing arranged through Daniel's foundation contacts within hours, Daniel carried both boys out to his car wrapped in blankets from the trunk, Charlie still trembling but slowly calming in his brother's arms. Ethan whispering a steady stream of reassurance that Daniel suspected the boy had been repeating to himself for 2 years just to survive. "It's over," Daniel told them both, his own voice unsteady with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Nobody is ever putting either of you in a room like that again. I promise you both, on everything I have, that chapter of your lives just ended forever." 3 days later, Daniel's private investigator, Layla Stone, spread photographs and documents across his dining table like evidence at a crime scene. Ethan was safely occupied at the hotel's supervised children's club, and Daniel had convinced him to act like a normal child for a few hours while the adults planned their rapidly escalating strategic war. "You're not going to like anything I found," Layla said grimly, her experienced face serious as she arranged the damning evidence. Acacia House has been under investigation by the Department of Child and Family Services for the past 18 months. Chronic understaffing, inadequate supervision of children, numerous complaints of systematic emotional abuse, emotional abuse, and financial irregularities that would make even accountants weep with fury. Daniel examined the photographs with growing horror. Children sleeping on thin mattresses in overcrowded dormitories on cold concrete floors, broken and dangerous playground equipment, held together with cheap tape. Hollow-eyed children carrying that particular silence that comes from hope being systematically crushed by adults in positions of power. "Why hasn't this horrific institution been shut down already?" Daniel asked, his voice tightly controlled. "Politics, dirty money, the usual suspects," Layla answered with the professional cynicism of someone who'd spent 20 years investigating corruption. "Director Reeves has deep political connections within state government. Her brother-in-law sits on the Congressional Budget Committee. They also operate at significantly lower costs than other accredited facilities. That's exactly why the state keeps sending children there, to save money from the public budget." Layla pointed to another particularly damning photograph showing children eating what appeared to be substandard food. But here's what's genuinely interesting and increasingly sinister. In the past 6 months, 3 different families specifically applied to adopt Charlie's son. Every single one was told Ethan had serious and uncontrollable behavioral problems that made him unsuitable for placement. Behavioral problems like protecting his little brother and asking uncomfortable questions about institutional neglect, Daniel said with rising fury. "Precisely," Layla confirmed. "I interviewed former staff members who left completely disgusted with the institution's practices. They painted an entirely different picture of Ethan. Responsible beyond his years, genuinely compassionate. He actively helped younger children adjust to the hostile environment, secretly taught several kids to read using books he'd smuggled in. He even organized secret birthday celebrations using contraband treats he somehow acquired." Layla's face darkened with professional outrage. But she was also asking very uncomfortable questions. Why were siblings being deliberately separated? Why were certain children receiving preferential treatment? Why did adoption processes keep mysteriously falling through? Daniel felt his carefully controlled anger transforming into something genuinely volcanic, a direct threat to the profitable system of dysfunction they had built. It gets darker and even more disturbing, Layla continued relentlessly. Charlie had 4 serious adoption attempts, mysteriously fail over the past year. Each time, potential families claimed he was too traumatized, unhealthily, and pathologically attached to his brother. He cried uncontrollably for Ethan. He refused to eat properly. He suffered panic attacks so severe, they required emergency medical intervention. Layla pulled out another thick document folder. The last family filed an official complaint with the Department of Child and Family Services, stating the institution never properly disclosed the extent of the child's psychological damage that directly resulted from deliberately keeping him separated from the one person in the world who could actually help him heal and develop normally. There's more, and it's going to break your heart, Layla said, her professional voice softening with genuine human compassion. I found Ethan and Charlie's original case files, along with detailed newspaper coverage of their parents' death. 2 years ago, a midwinter house fire caused by faulty electrical wiring, Ethan woke up smelling smoke, managed to get Charlie out of his crib, and carried him through the burning house to safety. He saved his brother's life. Daniel had to grip the edge of the table to remain standing. Ethan was 6 years old at the time, and he carried his 4-year-old brother through a collapsing house around them. This courageous 8-year-old had already lost everything once, then literally carried his brother through fire to safety, and for 2 years had desperately fought to keep his family together within a system deliberately designed to separate them for financial gain. The story broke nationally within a week, thanks largely to investigative journalist Sarah Adams, who had been quietly working her own sources inside the Department of Child and Family Services for nearly a year before Daniel's case gave her the concrete evidence and a sympathetic, high-profile face to finally publish everything she'd uncovered. Her first article, titled The Punishment Room, ran with photographs Layla Stone had helped verify and testimony from 4 former Acacia House employees willing to go on record once they saw Reeves already in custody. The piece did not stop at one facility. Sarah's continuing investigation, published over 6 installments across 2 months, traced a pattern of underfunded, poorly overseen group homes across 3 states where children like Ethan and Charlie had been quietly separated from siblings, punished with isolation, and systematically discouraged from being adopted whenever their continued presence in state custody meant continued per diem funding for administrators more interested in balancing budgets than protecting the children in their care. The series won a National Journalism Award the following spring, and more importantly, prompted a congressional hearing on child welfare oversight, where Daniel testified alongside Layla Stone and with careful preparation from Dr. Rachel Kane to ensure it wouldn't re-traumatize him, a composed and remarkably articulate 10-year-old Ethan, whose testimony about the punishment room was later cited directly in the language of the federal legislation that would eventually carry his name. Ethan had insisted on testifying himself rather than letting adults speak entirely on his behalf, a decision Dr. Kane supported after months of careful preparation, believing that reclaiming his own story in his own words, in front of the very lawmakers who could change the system that had failed him, might complete something the therapy alone could not. When a senator asked him, gently, whether he was afraid to be in that room telling his story to strangers, Ethan considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything. I used to be afraid all the time, he said. Afraid Charlie would get hurt, afraid nobody would believe us, afraid I'd get in trouble for asking questions. But I'm not in that room anymore, and Charlie's not either. So now the only thing I'm afraid of is if I don't say something, some other kid is going to end up in a room just like it, and nobody's going to come for them the way somebody came for us. The hearing room, packed with lawmakers, reporters, and children's advocates from across the country, remained completely silent for several long seconds after he finished speaking. Charlie's recovery took longer and looked different than Ethan's. For months after the rescue, he refused to sleep anywhere except within sight of his brother's bed. And any raised voice, even in excitement or laughter, would send him rigid and silent for the rest of the day. Dr. Kane worked with him twice weekly, patient and unhurried, never pushing him to talk about the punishment room before he was ready, focusing instead on rebuilding slowly his basic sense that the world could be safe and predictable. The breakthrough came nearly 5 months in, on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Charlie spontaneously asked Daniel to read him a bedtime story without first checking that Ethan was in the room. A small, unremarkable request that made Daniel excuse himself afterward to stand alone in the hallway and cry with relief for several minutes before he trusted himself to speak normally again. 6 months into the most intense legal battle of his life, Daniel sat in Judge Patricia Owens's solemn courtroom, watching Ethan nervously straighten the collar of his new shirt, while Charlie carefully practiced writing his new legal name, Charlie Cross, in his best first-grade handwriting. The final adoption hearing would begin in minutes, legally formalizing what had already become emotional truth in their hearts since that gray December day, when a desperate child asked a stranger to pretend to hug him. "Mr. Cross," Judge Owens said, carefully reviewing the extraordinarily detailed case file before her, "I've served on this bench for 35 years, but I've never witnessed an adoption case quite like this one. Ethan and Charlie, do you fully understand what's happening here today?" Ethan straightened with the natural calm he'd developed through months of intensive family therapy and emotional healing. "Yes, Your Honor. Today you're going to make Mr. Cross our father forever, and we're officially going to be the Cross family." Charlie looked up from his careful writing. "And nobody can ever separate us again, right? Even if I still have nightmares sometimes, or Ethan asks smart questions that some adults don't like." Judge Owens's eyes filled with genuine emotion. "Exactly right, Charlie. Today you become a family forever, legally and emotionally, and nothing in this world can ever change that fact." The courtroom was filled with an extraordinary community of supporters. Detective Rachel Moore and the investigative team who had become genuine family friends through months of intense investigation. Psychologist Dr. Rachel Kane, who had guided them through the difficult but transformative months of psychological healing. Award-winning journalist Sarah Adams, whose investigative reporting series had triggered comprehensive national reforms in the child welfare system, and most touchingly, dozens of rescued children and their new families. All present because of Ethan and Charlie's extraordinary courage. Daniel's eyes inevitably drifted to the back row, where former director Diane Reeves sat handcuffed between 2 police officers, now facing likely life imprisonment for her central role in a multi-state abuse network. But Daniel had specifically requested her presence for reasons that went far beyond mere legal procedure. "Diane Reeves," Judge Owens said with absolute authority, turning directly to the defendant, "you requested to make a formal statement before this adoption is finalized. The court will hear your words, but I'm explicitly warning you that any attempt to disrupt or taint these proceedings will result in immediate and permanent removal." Reeves rose slowly, her face dramatically thinner after months of custody. When she spoke, she had completely lost her once intimidating authority. "These extraordinary children need to know something important," she began, her eyes genuinely filled with tears as she looked directly at Ethan and Charlie. "For years I convinced myself I was preparing children for the real world, that making them strong meant breaking them first through harsh discipline. But watching how this investigation unfolded, watching the incredible achievements you've accomplished, witnessing the hundreds of children you've courageously helped rescue," her voice broke into genuine sobs. "You were never broken or in need of repair. You were the bravest, most resilient children I've ever known. And I was so damaged by my own traumatic childhood that I couldn't recognize real strength when it stood right in front of me. Ethan quietly stood from his chair and walked with quiet dignity directly to stand before Reeves. The entire courtroom collectively held its breath, watching this 8-year-old boy courageously face the woman who had systematically tormented him for 2 years. "Miss Reeves," Ethan said with powerful calm, "I completely forgive you. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying hatred would diminish who I am as a person, and I'm going to be too busy being happy and helping other children to waste any energy on being small or vengeful." The silence that followed was profoundly healing and transformative. Reeves collapsed back into her chair, sobbing with what appeared to be genuine remorse for the first time in her adult life. "Ethan's son and Charlie's son, by the legal authority vested in me by the state of New York, I officially and permanently declare you adopted by Daniel Cross. Your legal names are now Ethan Cross and Charlie Cross, and you are forever members of the Cross family." The courtroom erupted in joyful applause and tears of celebration. Daniel dropped to his knees as both boys simultaneously threw themselves into his arms, holding them as if he could physically absorb all their past pain and replace it with pure, unconditional love. 2 years later, Daniel watched now 10-year-old Ethan patiently teaching chess to 3 newly adopted siblings, while 8-year-old Charlie read stories in hushed whispers to newly arrived 5-year-old twins who still only communicated in fearful whispers. Their expansive home in Westchester had transformed into a genuine sanctuary for 8 children once considered too troubled or too old for adoption, each carrying their own survival story, each contributing their own unique light to this extraordinary family they had built together. The path to 8 children had not been a single decision but a gradual, deliberate unfolding, each new child arriving only after careful preparation with Dr. Kane. Family meetings where Ethan and Charlie were given real voice in whether and when the household should grow again, a rule Daniel insisted on from the very beginning, understanding instinctively that children who had once been treated as inconvenient line items in someone else's budget needed, more than almost anything else, to feel that their opinions about their own family carried real weight. The twins, Maya and Noah, had come from a different group home entirely, one without Reeves's particular cruelties, but with its own quieter failures of attention. And it was Charlie, remarkably, who had insisted they be the next to join the family, recognizing something of his own old fear in their silence, sitting with them for hours at a time in the beginning, not talking, just present. The same wordless, steady company Ethan had once offered him in far worse circumstances. 2 older boys, brothers themselves, Marcus and Dre, had aged out of one placement after another for being, in the language of overworked caseworkers, difficult to place together. A phrase that had come to mean something very specific and very personal to both Daniel and Ethan by then. The phone rang. Sarah Adams calling with wonderful news that new federal child protection legislation bearing Ethan and Charlie's names had just been signed into law. Comprehensive reforms ensuring no child would ever again be separated from siblings for mere bureaucratic convenience. "Mr. Cross," came his new assistant Emily's cheerful voice, a young woman who had grown up in the foster system herself and now coordinated the Foundation's rapidly expanding adoption programs. 15 new families were certified this week, and the training center in Columbus officially opened its doors. The Alice Cross Children's Foundation, which Daniel had originally imagined as a modest scholarship fund, had grown within 3 years into a multi-state operation with 42 full-time staff, a legal aid division that had successfully reunited 11 sibling groups who'd been wrongly separated, and a whistleblower protection program that had already prompted the closure of 2 more facilities operating under conditions disturbingly similar to what Charlie had once endured. Layla Stone left private investigation work entirely to run the foundation's internal audit division, tracking exactly the kind of financial irregularities that had once protected Diane Reeves for years, ensuring no administrator anywhere in the Foundation's growing network of partner facilities could again mistake children's suffering for an acceptable operating cost. Layla kept, framed on her office wall, a copy of the very first photograph she'd shown Daniel that night at his dining table, a reminder, she told new investigators she trained, of exactly why the tedious, unglamorous work of auditing budgets and cross-referencing complaint records actually mattered. Because somewhere behind every falsified expense report was a child whose entire childhood depended on someone finally being bothered enough to check the numbers. Daniel smiled, watching his home filled with laughter, animated homework discussions, and the loving chaos only truly large families understand. On the living room wall hung a framed photograph of Alice smiling warmly, and Daniel felt completely certain she was smiling because of all this beautiful chaos surrounding him now. He still talked to her sometimes, late at night after the house had finally gone quiet. Standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea he rarely finished, telling her about Ethan's latest chess tournament, or Charlie's newest favorite book, or the twins' slowly emerging laughter, a sound that had taken nearly a year to arrive and now seemed to fill every corner of the house whenever it appeared. He no longer felt the specific hollow grief that had sent him wandering through lower Manhattan in the rain that December evening. What remained instead was something quieter and more durable, gratitude braided so tightly into loss that he could no longer fully separate the two and had stopped trying to. Alice would have loved every single one of these children fiercely and without reservation. He was certain of that in the way he was certain of very few things anymore. And some nights that certainty was the closest thing to her presence he had left. And it was enough. Because sometimes when you're completely lost and hopeless, all you need is one brave child asking you to pretend you're hugging him. And sometimes when you pretend to embrace someone, you discover the embrace was real all along, and that some of the best families in this world begin with strangers who chose not to look away from each other precisely when they needed each other most. Daniel never forgot that the entire story, everything that followed, the foundation, the legislation, the 8 children now filling his once empty house with noise and light, began with a single choice made in under 3 seconds on a rain-soaked sidewalk, a choice that cost him nothing but his attention in the moment and reshaped the rest of his life beyond anything his grief counselor or his lawyer or even Daniel himself could have imagined possible that gray December afternoon. He thought about that often, how close he had come to walking past, lost in his own private fog, how easily a distracted, grieving man might have simply kept walking and never felt the small, desperate hands grab his coat at all. It was not a lesson he tried to teach the children directly, but it was one he hoped, quietly, they would absorb simply by living inside the family it had built. That paying attention to the person right in front of you, even when your own heart is breaking, might matter more than anything else you ever do. And if this incredible story of transformation and hope has moved you, please leave a like so more people can discover this powerful reminder of compassion's true power. Want more heartwarming stories that remind us of humanity's fundamental goodness? Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible stories. Now, we genuinely want to hear your honest thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a simple act of kindness completely transform someone's life? Share your story with our community, and don't forget to share this video with someone who desperately needs a dose of hope today. Someone who needs to believe that small acts of courage can truly transform the entire world. We'll see you in the next story as we continue exploring how unconditional love can heal even the deepest wounds and create families in the places we least expect them.